So in this video we are going to be looking at event tracking under the hood, uh, inside which essentially we are going to be covering three topics. First would be what is data layer, how it works, and more specifically how the data layer push function works. Then secondly we'll see how to use auto event tracking efficiently, and thirdly we could see some problems that could arrive during auto event tracking and see some workarounds about it. Right. So let's get started firstly with the data layer. Now your data layer is basically a global data structure in JavaScript. Right. Now what this means is global, we already saw global in JavaScript means that it is accessible from any JavaScript, be it JavaScript from the HTML or JavaScript from the GTM. It is accessible from any JavaScript if it's a global variable. Right. And when working with a global data structure, it is best advised to use a global prefix. In this case it is window, so that whenever a person looks at your code, specifically a developer, they know that since you're using the global prefix, they know that you're working with a global data structure. Now we know that a data layer has data in it in the form of key value pairs, so this will be your key and there will be some value. All right. Now this could be anything. In we have seen in previous examples where we worked with e-commerce data, so this could be your user ID, and then this could be the value of the user ID such as 123. And the event, this is essentially a good practice that you add the name of the custom event which is happening, because we saw in the case of e-commerce as well, when the data layer push was happening, we got the message of data layer push happening, but the data actually got pushed into the message event that came with it. So that's not really helpful to us. So we name it by ourselves, and the message event will be named whatever you put here. All right. Suppose you put e-commerce update here, so that message event will be named as e-commerce update, and it can then be used to set up triggers on based on that event. So this is a good practice to keep in mind. Now let's see, let's go to our preview here. Connect. So if I were to go to inspect, and within inspect console, firstly let's clear this, and then if I were to type window data layer here, I would get the data layer, which is essentially an array. So this is the first item, and it always starts with index number 0. So your first item will have the index number 0, your second item that is added will have the index number 1, and so on. And this is also the order in which the stuff was added. So the values were added in this exact order. Right. Now let's go here, and suppose I go here, I go to data layer. You can see that gtm.init consent is getting added, then it's changing again. It's gtm.js, gtm.dom, gtm.load. So what's essentially happening is the latest value that's getting entered, the most recent value, is what stays in the data layer of gtm. Right. I'll show you an example as well. Now suppose I were to use a window data layer push function. All right. And in it, if I were to, let's say, push user ID, set it to 123. All right. And we can see it was successfully pushed. So now when I put window data layer, I can see that now there are 6 items, whereas previously there were 5 items. Right. Now there are 6 items. And if I look into it, you can see the index number 5, which is our 6th item, will have user ID 123. And even if we go back here, we got a message pop up in which we can see user ID 123 has been added. Now what I meant by having the most recent value, Right, now you can see that the user ID is 123, but suppose I were to add another value, dot push, and instead of 123 write it as 456. Right, now window dot data layer. Here I can see that we have 7 items, right? Both the pushes were successful and we have both the items here. But when I go here, in summary, you can see only the most recent value is captured and copied here. So whenever you're writing the push command, Google Tag Manager, it adds its own little push listener to that command, which translates the value into its own internal data structure, which is here, and gets the most recent value here. Now, why is this? Because it doesn't actually, the internal data structure doesn't actually have a memory of its own, so it doesn't capture the previous values. It only captures the most recent values. Right, now, and it only does this on the push command. So if I were to, let's say, use the pop command now, window.data layer dot pop, if I were to remove the latest entry, we can see this entry was removed, and let's say we remove the other user ID as well. Alright, so both our entries have been removed. Now if I look here, window data layer, we can see that we have returned to having only 5 items. Now we don't have a user ID that we had entered, right? But here if I come back to summary, we can still see the user ID 456, which means that it only worked on the push command. It didn't work on the pop command, and similarly it won't work on the slice command as well. So only on the push command it has its own little push listener, which can translate the value into its own internal data structure. So this is how the data layer in GTM actually works. Right. Now this was all about the data layer. Now let's move on to auto event tracking. So for that we'll come back to our Google Tag Manager, and in triggers we'll go to new, and firstly the ones that come under page view are not auto event triggers. They are something called as default events that are there in Google Tag Manager. Now to elaborate them, I'll go to preview again. So the reason why we call them default events is because they automatically occur here. Now consent initialization, and they occur in this very order itself. So firstly the consent initialization is uh, a trigger just to see if all the consent settings are being honored or not, and then there's the initialization, which you could use instead of consent initialization in some cases. Then you have your container loaded, which is essentially your page view, which means that the page has loaded, but the contents have not yet loaded, just the page has started loading, or that user has shown intent of viewing the page. Then there's the DOM ready, when your HTML is actually been passed, which means the code has actually loaded, but the contents of the page have not yet fully loaded. Then there's window loaded, which means that the code has been loaded and then the contents of the page have also been loaded. Suppose you have a video or photo or something embedded on your site, and all those elements have loaded. That is your window loaded. Then yeah, moving back to Google Tag Manager and triggers, we'll look at what our auto event triggers are. So they start from here. Firstly, you have your click all elements, which means if you select this and set it on all clicks, and if you click anywhere on the site, it will register that as an event. Or you could even further refine it to some clicks, where you could enter certain conditions. Like suppose you could enter that the URL of the page should contain portfolio, and only under that page, if I click somewhere, only then I want event to fire. So you could further refine it. Then discard, and then there's just links. Just links is again, it comes under clicks, but for buttons or links that have an anchor tag around them, which mean they lead to some other URL. So for that you could use just links. So for example, we had the home page and there was an about page button. So I was on the portfolio website itself, but then index.html changed to about.html, so that it led me to a new page. uh, for that purpose you could use a just links. And in case there is an anchor tag present, it is recommended to use the just links trigger, because it is already refined to look for just link clicks. Then there's under user engagement you have your element visibility trigger, which means if suppose 50% of an element is visible on your site. Alright, suppose I have a name on my site and only 50% of it is visible. If I set it to 50%, if I set that element visibility to 50%, then whenever 50% of that element is visible on the site, I could fire a tag. Or you could set it to 100% when the element is fully visible. Right, so you could play with it like that. Then there's form submission trigger. So whenever a form is being submitted on your website, it could fire a tag based on that. Then there's scroll depth. Suppose you want to fire a tag based on what percentage of your site has been scrolled. Suppose I scroll down 25% of the site and I want a tag to fire under that condition. I could set it using scroll depth trigger. Again, we have used all of these. So previously we had seen which event do you want to enable this trigger on. You could set it to anything, then vertical scroll depths or horizontal scroll depths, and we had previously entered 10, 25, 50, 75, 90, so that whenever a user scroll down those past those values, we would fire a tag. Then after that you have your YouTube video. Suppose you have a YouTube video embedded on your website and you want to track the user engagement with the YouTube video. You want to see the event, when it was started, when it paused, and how much of it was completed and how many times it was completed. All that information you could use the YouTube video trigger. Then you have the other triggers, in which there's the custom event trigger, which we again saw earlier, that whenever you name the message event to something, you could then type the event name here. Suppose I named the message event as e-commerce update, so and I want a tag to fire on that event, I could just enter that name here, and that's how the custom event trigger would work. Now it's not only just limited to the e-commerce update or page section update. You could put any event name here and it would fire the tag that is associated with it. Alright. Then again, in others you have more, such as there's history change. So for example, and this usually happens in single page applications, that whenever the URL fragment of the site is changing, then you could use a history change trigger to fire an event accordingly. And then there's JavaScript error trigger, which means that if there's an uncaught JavaScript error, then you could fire a tag using this trigger. This could be helpful in finding out the uncaught errors in your code or on your page. Then there's the timer trigger. Suppose you want to fire a tag 30 seconds after a page has loaded, you could do that by using the timer trigger. Then finally there's the trigger group. It means that you could have a combination of trigger under it inside the trigger group, and only when all the conditions for all the triggers are met in the trigger group, only then the trigger group fires as a whole. Right. Suppose I have scroll depth and form submission. So scroll depth I have set it as 50. So only after a user has scrolled down 50% and then submitted a form, only then I want the trigger group to fire. Only then will the trigger group fire. So that's how it works. Or vice versa, if the form is being submitted or 50% of the page is scrolled. So basically all the conditions need to be satisfied in order for the whole of trigger group to fire. So this was how you could use your auto event triggers. Now coming back to some problems that could occur while using the auto event triggers or in the auto event tracking. So there's this site, if you go to it, and this is essentially your DOM model, right? Document object model. Now, what happens is it's in a hierarchical stage, right? So, firstly there's the window, then there's document, there HTML body, table body, then under it there's your table rows and table cells, and finally the table cells have some values. So what's happening is it it essentially has three phases. Firstly, there's the capture phase. So when a click is happening, suppose like this cell is being clicked. So when a click is happening, the capture phase, what it does, this event goes down to the click that's happening, and then it becomes the target phase. The target phase comes into play because this cell becomes the target then, and then this event that happened, it again goes back up to the GTM. Now, instead of the GTM going down to every event or every click that's happening, the clicks go up in the bubbling phase to the GTM. Now, this is helpful because if the GTM were to be set on every event, there would be an overload of sorts. So, this is an easy way or a more convenient way or a more convenient model, you could say. Uh, so yeah, firstly there's the capture phase where the event goes down to the click that's happened, then the target phase, what has been clicked, and then what's been clicked is then registered, and it goes as an event to GTM. Now, some problems that could occur with it is that now if you had a certain JavaScript code or a jQuery code running on your website which didn't allow the information to go up to GTM. Suppose you have a click happening on the target on the table cell, right? But then just one step above it, there's a table row. Suppose here I had a code which blocked this information from going upstairs. So then GTM won't get the information, and simultaneously we won't have the tags or triggers firing. So this would make event tracking impossible because the information is being blocked here, it's not going upstairs, and this could happen in some cases when you're working with JavaScript or jQuery. So we'll look into that as well. So if you have certain JavaScript code that looks like this, where if you click a button, then you can see within it there's stop propagation, which means that it's stopping the propagation of data, which means that it will stop right here. If it's set on this button, it will stop right here. It won't go back to the document where our GTM is actually listening. So then there's prevent default as well, which means it just won't go to the thank you page. The default action is being prevented. It won't go to the thank you page. Instead, we'll get an alert that says thank you. Right. So if you have something like this in your code, that could prevent information going to the document. Also, if you're working with jQuery, within jQuery we have something called as return false, alright, which basically just combines these two, right? And again, if you have that in your jQuery code, again that could be one reason why information is not going to the top of the document. So instead of return false, you could just use prevent default, but again you have to confirm with your developer so that it doesn't break something in the code or something in the website. So yeah, this is how you could have a workaround of the problem. Like you could remove the return false and just use prevent default, but again you'll have to consult your developer for that. But yeah, so we covered three topics in event tracking under the hood. Firstly, we saw what the data layer is, how it works, and how it essentially, we saw how the data layer push function works. Then we moved on to auto event listeners, how to use them efficiently, and then the problems that could happen while using them. And again, these could mainly occur while using a form submission trigger or a just links trigger. So keep that in mind. And yeah, these are the 3 points that we covered in the video. Thank you for watching.